Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something that, well, isn't exactly thrilling, but it's strangely fascinating, what it was like to wake up in a Victorian home. Imagine yourself in a dark, freezing bedroom, your feet hitting a wooden floor so cold that it feels like you're stepping onto ice. You've got your trusty wool blanket, but it's not exactly a comfy duvet. You can barely see the outlines of your room, and all you hear are the creaks and moans of the house settling as it fights the chill of a long winter night. But hold up, before you rush into the past with me, let's remember that we're not just looking at any history. We're looking at a time when getting out of bed meant battling the cold, poor lighting, and maybe even your own body, which wasn't used to the discomfort. And you probably won't survive this, but we'll give it a try, right? So, before you settle in and drift into this space, if you find yourself enjoying what you're hearing, take a moment to hit like and subscribe, but only if it truly feels worth it to you. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. Always curious to hear from you all around the globe. Now, dim the lights a little. Maybe turn on a fan for a soft ambient hum. And let's begin tonight's journey gently together. In the early days of the Victorian era, homes were vastly different from the modern dwellings we take for granted. Heating systems? Non-existent. So, when you wake up in your room, you're not just dealing with a little chill. No, you're shivering under layers of blankets, your breath visible in the air as you exhale. The fireplace, if you're lucky enough to have one, has long since died down, leaving only the lingering scent of smoke and the quiet crackle of embers. You feel your feet reluctantly hit the floor, and you can almost hear the creak of the floorboards beneath you as they groan under the weight of the day ahead. And yet, it's the same darkness that gives you the first moment of freedom. The sun hasn't risen yet, but you're wide awake, your body telling you that it's time to get moving, whether you like it or not. You know it's only going to get colder, so it's better to get dressed now. But dressing? That's an adventure all on its own. Historians still argue about whether Victorian people really understood how to keep warm, considering that their homes didn't have central heating. The solution? Multiple layers of clothing, sometimes too many for comfort, and thick woolen socks. And let's not forget the ever-present struggle of trying to stay warm with a candle or oil lamp flickering weakly in the corner of the room. It's not much, but it's enough to cast shadows that seem to dance on the walls, teasing you as you prepare to face the day. The lighting situation? Well, that's the first hurdle. As you fumble through your room, trying to find your shoes, you realize the morning light hasn't even begun to filter in. In fact, it's still pitch black outside, and you have to rely on whatever light you can get from your candle, which only gives off a dim glow. The oil lamp sitting on your dresser is barely better. These lights aren't just inconvenient, they're actually hazardous. They flicker out regularly, and you're left in near-complete darkness until you can light a new one. So much for modern convenience. Huh? The thing about lighting in the Victorian era is that it wasn't just a luxury. It was essential for survival, especially during the long winter months. People had to rely on their meager lamps and candles to guide their way through the night, even to use the restroom or make it to the kitchen. The luxury of easily flipping a switch and having your entire house light up, that was still centuries away. But instead of turning on a light to fight off the darkness, you'd find yourself creeping around in the half-light of an oil lamp, constantly adjusting the wick to make sure it didn't go out too soon. But imagine living like that. The cold inescapable, the light barely enough to keep the night at bay. Now, this might sound like a misery fest, but there's something kind of comforting about knowing that people in the past survived this. They woke up every day, went through their routines, and somehow made it work. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was a certain resilience to it all. You may find yourself thinking that it's easy to feel spoiled with all our modern conveniences, but in the grand scheme of things, people didn't let the lack of a cozy mattress, central heating, or instant lighting stop them from living. Imagine you're in 18th century Korea now. The sun has barely peeked over the horizon, but the struggle to get up is just as real. Only this time, instead of worrying about the cold and dim lighting like our Victorian friends, you're dealing with something a little more ancient. The room around you is dark, except for the flicker of a few small oil lamps, their light barely enough to distinguish the wood beams of the ceiling from the walls. You stretch, your muscles stiff, but there's something else you notice. the absence of any modern light sources. The struggle to make your way through the early hours isn't just about the weather, it's about lighting your home. In 18th century Korea, bringing light into your home wasn't a simple flick of a switch. It took time, effort, and, more than anything, careful preparation. People in this era didn't have the luxury of electric lights or even gas lamps to brighten their lives. Instead, they relied on a mix of candles, oil lamps, and fire. But the real kicker? It wasn't just about having light. It was about how they got it. Historians still argue about how much light these lamps and candles could really provide. Some claim they were more decorative than functional, while others insist that they were necessary for any kind of meaningful activity in the evening. Whatever the case, one thing was certain: light was not an afterthought. It was as much a part of daily life as the rice they ate or the clothes they wore. If you wanted light, you had to make it, and keep it alive. This meant constantly tending to your oil lamps, making sure the wicks were just right, and replenishing the oil as needed. And let's not forget about the use of lanterns, which were also popular in Korea at the time. These weren't your modern, shiny versions. No, these lanterns were much simpler, made from paper or fabric and held together with bamboo. You had to be extra careful with these, especially since fire was both a blessing and a curse in a home made of wood. But despite the potential danger, these lanterns helped guide people through the night, illuminating their paths, albeit in a rather dim, flickering way. What makes this even more interesting is how these practices evolved over time. You see, in Korea, as in many other places, the idea of light was intertwined with cultural practices. Light wasn't just for practicality, it was also symbolic. The glowing lanterns weren't just functional objects, but had meaning. They were often used in rituals or ceremonies, guiding people through the darkness of life and representing hope, warmth, and connection to the divine. But for all the meaning behind the light, the truth was that it wasn't much of a solution for the challenges people faced. Sure, there was some comfort in seeing that soft, flickering glow, but it hardly made the dark nights more pleasant. It's a bit like the feeling we get when we use a small nightlight to help us sleep. Sure, it helps, but it's not like you're basking in full sunlight, right? While you're sitting there, eyes slowly adjusting to the low light, you might wonder how people got used to this. No glowing smartphones or electric lights to help them along. It was all about making do. And in many ways, it's the same resourcefulness that allowed people to persevere through tough times. They didn't have the luxuries we take for granted, but they made their world work. Now, just imagine the shift in perspective when you consider how modern technology has completely transformed our relationship with light. The small oil lamp that once took hours to prepare is now replaced with a simple flip of a switch. The stark contrast between then and now isn't just technological, it's cultural. The way light once dictated every movement, every evening ritual, has now become almost an afterthought in the world of LEDs and Wi-Fi-enabled smart lights. But at that time, when you stood in a Korean room lit only by a single flickering lamp, you weren't just lighting a space. You were participating in a system that required patience, awareness, and a deep connection to the cycles of nature. It was a much slower, intentional world, one where every flicker of light had a purpose. Let's move to the Victorian era once again. But this time, we're not talking about the struggles of getting out of bed in the freezing cold or lighting up your house with flickering oil lamps. Now, we're focusing on the people who made it all happen, the Victorian mailmen. Imagine the scene. It's a chilly morning, the sky still dark, and you've just opened your front door to find the mailman trudging up your street, bundled up in layers, his breath visible in the cold air. But here's the kicker. He's been walking for hours, and he's still got miles to go. And unlike today, he won't be hopping into a car to drive from house to house. Oh no, he's walking 30 miles day after day, no exceptions. Historians still debate the efficiency of Victorian postal services, with some saying the system was surprisingly reliable, while others argue that it was a logistical nightmare. Either way, one thing is certain. Being a Victorian mailman was no easy job. You weren't just delivering letters. You were braving the elements, covering long distances, and doing it all on foot. And let's be real, walking 30 miles a day in the cold is no walk in the park. It was hard, exhausting work, and the postal workers didn't get a whole lot of credit for it. The first thing that strikes you about the Victorian mail system is how reliant it was on human stamina. There was no fancy mail truck to speed things up. You had to rely on your own 2 feet. The postal system was built around foot carriers, and they had strict schedules to keep. They didn't have GPS or smartphones to tell them which street to take next. They had to memorize every route, every shortcut, and every potential pitfall. And while we might think that walking 30 miles a day sounds like a form of punishment, there were a few perks. For one thing, these mailmen had the chance to really get to know the neighborhoods they served. They'd become familiar faces, stopping to chat with the locals, and often building a rapport with the people on their route. It wasn't a bad job if you didn't mind the walking and could stomach the cold weather. But then again, most of the time you were walking in dreary, gray conditions, dodging muddy puddles and navigating icy sidewalks. The perks? They were few and far between. There were times when things got even harder. For example, during winter months, when snow covered the roads, these poor mailmen had to keep moving, even as the streets became treacherous. No matter how bad the weather, the mail had to go through. And if you think about it, it wasn't just a matter of delivering news or bills. It was a matter of delivering life-altering messages. Letters from family members, job offers, invitations to important events. It wasn't just about mail. It was about connecting people to their lives, sometimes across great distances. In fact, mailmen in Victorian England had a serious sense of duty. It was almost like they were the glue that kept society connected, even in the face of overwhelming physical challenges. But it wasn't just about delivering messages. It was about providing a sense of normalcy. For people living in remote areas or places where transportation was scarce, these brave individuals were a lifeline. Imagine being in a small village, hearing nothing but the winds and the sounds of your everyday routine, only for that one letter to arrive, and suddenly, the world outside felt just a little closer. It wasn't just about the letters themselves. It was the symbolism of connection that mattered most. Of course, that doesn't mean the job was all glory. The reality was that these men faced brutal working conditions. They didn't have the warm, cushy offices that we associate with postal workers today. There were no cozy desks, no ergonomic chairs. Instead, it was long, grueling hours out in the cold, rain, or heat, all while carrying a heavy load. The bags they carried were weighed down by letters, packages, and sometimes even small parcels, making each step feel even heavier than the last. And despite all this, they received minimal compensation for the physically demanding work they did. If you think about it, the job of a Victorian mailman might sound like something out of a Dickens novel. A hard-working, determined character whose life is defined by a constant struggle against the elements. But the truth is that these men were heroes in their own right. They might not have had capes, but they were carrying something more important: the lifeblood of communication. Without them, society would have been far more isolated. So, next time you get that letter in the mail or you get a notification telling you your package has arrived, think back to those Victorian mailmen. 30 miles a day on foot in any weather, rain, snow, or shine. And suddenly, your parcel doesn't seem so bad. Does it? Now, let's take a step back in time all the way to ancient Rome, where you're lying in a modest yet surprisingly comfortable bed, considering the time. The walls of your small home are made from stone. The air smells faintly of burning wood, and you can hear the distant sounds of the bustling Roman streets. As the morning light filters in through the small window, you stretch your body, preparing for the day ahead. But before you rush into your daily routine, take a moment to appreciate something: the bed you're lying in. In ancient Rome, the way people slept was vastly different from our modern standards. The beds were often nothing more than simple wooden frames, topped with a layer of wool, straw, or down-filled mattresses. Sure, it wasn't as cushy as a memory foam mattress, but it had its advantages. You could adjust the level of comfort by adding or removing layers of straw. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of adjusting the firmness of your bed, but instead of a fancy app, you just shove more hay in there. Practical, right? Historians still argue over how comfortable Roman beds actually were. Some say they were surprisingly plush for the time, while others claim they were quite uncomfortable and more functional than luxurious. Regardless, It's safe to say that comfort wasn't the main goal in ancient Rome. These beds were designed for sleep, not for lounging around on a Sunday afternoon with Netflix. But while the beds might have been simple, the Roman approach to sleep was surprisingly sophisticated in some ways. For example, they were one of the first cultures to use bedding with distinct seasonal changes. During the hot summer months, Romans would sleep on thinner, lighter bedding using linen sheets to keep cool. In contrast, during the colder months, they'd pack on the blankets and woolen layers to fend off the cold. Imagine adjusting your bed's temperature by simply swapping out the bedding. It's like an ancient version of turning down the heat or cranking up the AC, except far less efficient. And let's not forget about the Romans' preference for sleeping in a certain way. Unlike today, where we prefer to sleep in a private, quiet room, many Romans shared their living spaces. Wealthier citizens might have their own rooms, but in general, families slept together in shared spaces, often on raised platforms. The Romans were a social bunch, and the communal nature of their sleep arrangements was just another reflection of that. You'd also find that most Romans, especially the working class, didn't get a full 8 hours of sleep. Instead, they practiced something called biphasic sleep. The idea was that people would sleep for a few hours after the sun went down, then wake up for a few hours during the night, often using that time for reading, socializing, or even going to the bathroom. After that, they'd go back to sleep for a second stretch. It's a bit different from our modern idea of a solid, uninterrupted night's rest, but it worked for them. The Romans were also early pioneers in the use of pillows. No, it wasn't exactly the fluffy, cloud-like cushions we have today, but rather small, firm pillows made from cloth and filled with wool or feathers. These weren't just for comfort, they were used to keep the head elevated, which helped with digestion, breathing, and even preventing snoring. It's fascinating how even in ancient times, people were already looking for ways to optimize their sleep. But despite these advances, the reality of sleep in ancient Rome wasn't all perfect. Romans often had to deal with the same challenges we face today: noisy neighbors, uncomfortable temperatures, and crowded living spaces. And if you lived in the city, there was no escaping the sounds of the streets, the clatter of carts, the chatter of the market, and the constant buzz of life. Not exactly the peaceful slumber we'd all hope for after a long day. Still, the Romans were resourceful. They understood the importance of sleep, even if their approach was vastly different from our own. They knew that rest was essential to maintain their hectic schedules, whether it was for a soldier on the march or a politician preparing for the next Senate debate. In fact, Roman leaders, including emperors, were often depicted in statues and paintings as having an almost divine connection to sleep. Rest was seen as a form of rejuvenation, both physically and mentally. So, as you lay in your bed in ancient Rome, you might think back to the simplicity and resourcefulness of the time. Sure, it wasn't the most comfortable sleep you've ever had, but it was functional. And in a world that didn't offer many luxuries, the Romans made the most of what they had. Just imagine how different it must have felt to sleep in a world without the noise of modern life. No traffic sounds, no TVs blaring, no sirens in the distance. Instead, it was the quiet of the night, broken only by the occasional footstep outside or the distant chatter of a nearby neighbor. It wasn't perfect, but it was a far cry from the chaos of today. Now, let's take a quick hop over to the medieval period, where we find ourselves in a small, dimly lit room, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. The air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Your bed is made of rough-hewn wood, a thin mattress stuffed with straw or wool, and the blankets, though numerous, are far from luxurious. As you lay there, trying to drift back to sleep, the sounds of the wind howling outside are almost drowned out by the low murmur of the others sharing the room with you. Medieval sleep habits were vastly different from anything we'd consider normal today. First off, privacy was a luxury most people simply didn't have. The majority of people in the Middle Ages slept in shared spaces, often with family members, servants, or even animals. The idea of a personal sanctuary, a room of your own, was a rare commodity. In fact, for peasants and workers, your bed could be anywhere, on the floor, in a loft, or just by the hearth. Often, people slept wherever there was space, bundled up with everyone else, trying to make it through the long, cold nights. Historians still debate whether medieval people slept better or worse than we do. On the one hand, they didn't have the distractions of modern life. No smartphones, no TVs, no blaring radios to keep them up at night. But on the other hand, their sleep was often interrupted, either by the needs of others or the harsh conditions of their environment. The thing about medieval sleep was that it was far from restful. If you were lucky enough to have a bed at all, it was more likely to be a rough, uncomfortable thing made from whatever materials were available: wood, straw, and maybe some thick wool blankets to keep you warm. And as if the physical discomfort weren't enough, medieval sleep was also influenced by something we'd find downright bizarre today: the concept of broken sleep. Instead of sleeping in one continuous stretch, medieval people often practiced something called segmented sleep. The pattern went like this. They would go to bed early, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night, sometimes for an hour or two. This waking period was often spent doing something productive: praying, reading, or just reflecting on the day. Afterward, they'd fall back to sleep for a second stretch, waking up again in the early morning. Now, the reason for this fragmented sleep pattern wasn't a lack of modern technology or comfort. It was simply the way the natural world worked. With the absence of artificial light, the long, dark nights of winter seemed to stretch on forever. People naturally adapted to this by waking up in the middle of the night and making use of the stillness. This concept of segmented sleep was common across many cultures in the medieval period, and it wasn't until the rise of artificial lighting in the 17th century that people began sleeping in one long stretch like we do today. But don't get too cozy just yet. The medieval world wasn't all idyllic, candlelit nights, and deep sleep. In fact, the chances of getting a good night's rest were slim. The ever-present threat of disease, pests, and noisy neighbors could make sleep a constant battle. The idea of sleep hygiene like we know it today didn't exist. People didn't regularly bathe or wash their bedding, and lice and fleas were common companions in the medieval world. So, while you might have your thick blankets and warm wool socks, you also had to contend with a few unpleasant roommates. Tiny, biting ones at that. One of the more interesting or disturbing aspects of medieval sleep was the idea of sleeping sickness. It was believed by some that the soul could wander while you slept, and to keep the soul from getting lost, you had to sleep in a certain position, often curled up, facing toward the hearth, or with a specific arrangement of pillows. There were also strange rituals and prayers performed before sleep to ensure a peaceful night. People believed that bad dreams were often caused by evil spirits or witches, so they would hang herbs over their beds to ward off these nighttime visitors. If you woke up with strange marks or a feeling of paralysis, it was often attributed to some kind of supernatural influence. In the absence of modern medicine, sleep disturbances like nightmares, sleep paralysis, and even conditions like insomnia were often viewed as signs of spiritual trouble. People didn't know much about sleep cycles or the reasons behind poor sleep, only that it could be a sign that something was wrong, either physically or spiritually. In a time when everything from illness to misfortune was attributed to unseen forces, sleep wasn't just a time for rest. It was a time of vulnerability. Despite all these challenges, medieval people were remarkably resilient. They made do with what they had, adapted to their harsh environments, and created their own little rituals to find peace during the long, dark nights. The idea of sleep, while not as comfortable as today, was still essential. After all, no matter how uncomfortable, how cold, or how crowded, sleep was the one thing that allowed people to recharge and keep going. So, as you drift off to sleep in your medieval hut, surrounded by the warmth of your family and a few animals, you might reflect on how different it is from our modern sleep experiences. Sure, we have memory foam mattresses and sound machines, but we also have far more distractions. Perhaps, in some strange way, the medieval method of sleeping in segments with a brief period of wakefulness in the middle of the night was a way of embracing the world around them. They made their peace with the darkness, and they knew that, no matter how rough the sleep, they could face the challenges of the day ahead. Now, let's travel to ancient Egypt, where your bed is far more extravagant than the straw and wool-filled mattresses of the medieval world. Picture yourself in the comfort of a finely crafted wooden bed, adorned with intricate carvings. You lie down on soft linen sheets, and though it's still hot outside, you can feel a faint breeze through the open window. The scent of fresh flowers from the garden outside wafts in, mixing with the earthy aroma of clay and stone from the room's walls. It's a stark contrast to the cold and cramped conditions of the medieval era, and this time you're in a world of luxury. Egyptian beds were a class symbol. The wealthy, especially the pharaohs and high-ranking officials, enjoyed beds made from finely carved wood, often gilded or painted with elaborate designs. These beds were built with a raised platform, and unlike the simple wooden frames of Roman or medieval beds, Egyptian beds often had intricately designed footrests and were often equipped with a headrest. The headrest itself is a significant piece of ancient Egyptian furniture. It was designed to support the head while sleeping, protecting the hair and, in some cases, allowing the sleeping person to keep their hair free from being flattened during rest. Historians still debate whether the raised beds of ancient Egypt were purely for comfort or if they had a deeper cultural significance. Some believe the elevation helped with air circulation to keep people cool during the hot desert nights, while others argue that the raised position was symbolic, elevating the person's body off the ground, a visual representation of their elevated status in society. After all, not everyone could afford such luxuries. The linen sheets, while a luxury compared to medieval wool, were not just for comfort. They were a sign of wealth, and the better the linen, the higher the person's social standing. For the elite, sheets could be dyed in rich colors or adorned with patterns that depicted religious or cultural symbols. These beds weren't just a place to sleep. They were an important part of the home's decor, contributing to a sense of refinement and status. But the luxury of an Egyptian bed wasn't just in its design. It was also about how the Egyptians viewed sleep itself. Sleep in ancient Egypt was not just a biological necessity. It was deeply connected to religious beliefs and the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that the soul left the body during sleep, entering a realm where it would be judged. This belief in the separation of body and soul during sleep meant that beds weren't just for comfort. They were sacred places. The tombs of Egyptian elites, especially those of pharaohs, often included miniature beds and sleeping items that were believed to provide comfort in the afterlife. Unlike in medieval Europe, where sleep was often a practical necessity to recharge for another day of hard labor, the Egyptians had a much more spiritual view of sleep. Their focus was on dreams, which they believed were messages from the gods. Certain dreams were thought to foretell the future, while others were believed to be direct communications with the divine. In fact, dream interpreters were highly respected in ancient Egypt, and one of the most famous pieces of literature from this period, the Instruction of Ani, included advice on how to interpret dreams. Now, as you settle into your linen sheets, you may begin to drift off to sleep, but you aren't just preparing for rest. In ancient Egypt, sleep was a connection to the divine. Your mind, even as it rests, is expected to interact with the gods in some way. Perhaps you'll dream of the gods themselves, or perhaps you'll have visions of your future. Your soul, free from the constraints of the physical world, might wander to realms where judgment and wisdom await. While today we sleep to recharge for the next day, the ancient Egyptians had a much more profound relationship with sleep. They didn't just see it as rest. It was part of a larger cosmic order, a connection to a greater, unseen world. And as you close your eyes, letting the cool desert breeze brush your skin, you may find yourself drifting into a realm where the boundary between the living and the divine is blurred. As you wake up in the morning, you'll find yourself refreshed not only in body but also in spirit. The Egyptians believed that sleep and dreams were integral to a person's spiritual health. A night of good sleep, filled with divine dreams, was considered a blessing. It was more than just a break from reality, it was a connection to the eternal. In the world of ancient Egypt, sleep wasn't merely a physical need. It was a sacred practice, tied to the gods and the afterlife. And as you rise from your raised bed, you might take a moment to reflect on how our modern beds and sleep rituals, though vastly different, are still a refuge from the hustle of daily life, even if we don't consider them to be divine. Let's now jump ahead to the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, a time when sleep and work were tied together in ways we can barely imagine today. Picture yourself in the middle of a smog-choked city, the air heavy with soot and the ever-present sound of clanking machinery. It's early in the morning, and as you drag yourself out of bed, probably made from some simple wood and straw, you're already aware that today will be like every other day in this industrial nightmare. The streets outside are filled with the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the shouts of factory workers, and the general hum of life that's about to begin its monotonous grind. You live in a world where the factory whistle sounds early in the morning, a harsh reminder that your day is about to start. Again, the Industrial Revolution brought with it a new kind of work ethic, one that didn't care whether you were well-rested or not. The factory workers in the 18th century didn't have the luxury of a comfortable bed or a peaceful night's rest. Instead, they were expected to work long hours, often in cramped and poorly ventilated spaces, where sleep was not a priority. It was something to be sacrificed for the sake of productivity. Historians still argue over how sleep was affected by the Industrial Revolution. Some say that the long working hours and poor conditions led to widespread exhaustion and even early death for many factory workers, while others suggest that people found ways to adapt. Whatever the case, sleep was something that was increasingly regulated by the factory clock, rather than the natural rhythms of the body. The factory system was brutal in its demands. Unlike the flexible schedules of farmers or craftsmen, factory workers were expected to adhere to strict timetables. The long shifts, often lasting 12 to 14 hours, didn't leave much room for rest. If you were lucky, you might have a few minutes to grab a quick nap during a short break, but for the most part, sleep was something you had to fit into whatever time you had left over. If you were one of the lucky few who could afford better accommodations, you might have a bed to sleep in, but for most, a shared space with dozens of other workers was the reality. And then there was the issue of lighting. In the dark factories, workers relied on dim, flickering candles or gas lamps, their weak light offering little comfort as they toiled through long hours. The work environment was so harsh that many factory workers began to develop sleep disorders, as the noise, the lack of ventilation, and the constant exposure to dangerous materials disrupted their natural sleep cycles. In fact, sleep deprivation became a common ailment, and it wasn't unusual for workers to feel the effects of exhaustion throughout the day, especially after working late into the night. One of the most unsettling aspects of industrial sleep was the way it blurred the lines between work and rest. In the past, sleep had been a time of rejuvenation, a way to prepare for the next day. But in the factory system, sleep was viewed as something you simply had to manage around the demands of work. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, the traditional patterns of sleep were lost, and people began to experience a kind of fragmented, restless sleep that was more about survival than rest. It wasn't until the advent of more modern work regulations in the 20th century that people began to reclaim the idea of a work-life balance, and with it, a healthier relationship with sleep. Despite the grueling conditions, workers during the Industrial Revolution adapted in fascinating ways. Some found respite in the rare moments they could steal for themselves, perhaps a quiet evening in a local pub or a short nap between shifts. But even then, sleep was never guaranteed. The relentless nature of the work, combined with the harsh environmental factors, made sleep an elusive commodity. For many, the factory whistle was as much a signal of exhaustion as it was a marker for the start of another endless day. In a way, the Industrial Revolution was a turning point in how we thought about sleep. Before this, sleep was a natural rhythm, something that occurred in alignment with the rise and fall of the sun. People slept when they could, but after the Industrial Revolution, sleep became a luxury, something that had to be fought for in a world that prioritized productivity over personal well-being. The new work environment not only disrupted sleep cycles, but also changed the way people viewed rest. Sleep was no longer a natural, unstructured event. It became something you had to plan around your daily grind. As you lie in your bed, listening to the distant sounds of the factory whistle, signaling the start of another grueling day, you might begin to feel the weight of it all. The promise of rest, of rejuvenation, feels like a distant memory. The factory clock is ticking, and before long, you'll have to drag yourself out of bed, ready to face the monotony of another shift. The idea of peaceful, uninterrupted sleep is just that, an idea, a concept from a time long gone. But in the midst of this brutal, mechanized world, there is something incredibly resilient about the human ability to adapt. Despite the exhaustion, despite the noise and the harsh conditions, people found ways to survive. And that resilience, that determination to keep going even when sleep feels impossible, is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Let's jump to the bustling streets of 18th century Paris, where the candlelight flickers as you settle in for the night. You can hear the distant hum of life, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, and the chatter of passers-by as you make your way into your modest home. It's been a long day, and you're ready to sleep, but there's one problem. The night in Paris isn't as quiet and peaceful as it is in rural villages. In fact, the city seems to come alive after dark, with taverns and markets still running, and the flicker of candles illuminating every street corner. In the late 1700s, Paris was a city that never truly rested, and neither did its people. While we might imagine the streets of Paris to be romantic and charming, the reality was often noisy and crowded. The streets were filled with vendors, performers, and late-night revelers, all contributing to a sense of constant activity. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep while the sounds of the city echoed through your windows. Historians still argue about how people in cities like Paris slept. Was it possible to get a restful night's sleep amidst the noise and bustle of a growing metropolis? Some suggest that people in the city learned to sleep in spite of the noise, while others claim that the ever-present sounds of the city contributed to a more fragmented, unrestful sleep. Either way, the advent of city life meant that sleep was no longer something that happened naturally with the rise and fall of the sun. Instead, people had to adapt to the urban rhythm of life, where sleep was a luxury that had to be carved out amidst the chaos. While the wealthy had their luxurious bedrooms with heavy curtains and thick walls to block out the noise, the common folk were not so fortunate. In fact, many Parisians slept in crowded, shared spaces, where the noise and smells of the streets infiltrated their homes. The rising middle class might have had more comfort than the working poor, but the noise of the street was still ever present. As you lie in your own bed, the flickering light of a candle dances on the walls. The warmth from the fire in the hearth provides some comfort, but the sounds of the city continue to press in. You hear the occasional shout from a street vendor or the clattering of a cart rolling by. The city's energy, alive even at night, is a constant reminder that in the urban environment, sleep wasn't a quiet, peaceful affair. It was something to be squeezed in between the rhythms of the city, and the idea of true silence became increasingly rare. In the 18th century, sleep in Paris was as much about adaptation as it was about exhaustion. People had to make do with what they had, finding comfort in shared spaces, learning to sleep through the noise, and using whatever means necessary to create some semblance of peace. The rise of gas lighting in the early 1800s would help to extend the hours of productivity. But for now, candlelight and oil lamps were the primary source of illumination. And the candles themselves were not just for lighting but for setting the tone. A single flickering flame cast long shadows and brought a sense of intimacy to the room. But despite the romantic ambience, the candles themselves were not without their problems. They required constant attention, lighting them, trimming the wicks, and replenishing the wax. Much like how today we depend on electric lights, people in Paris had to get creative to make their nights more manageable. In fact, many families would use simple devices like lanterns or larger oil lamps to bring more light to the room, hoping it would extend the hours of productivity or give a little more time for rest. But it wasn't just about the light. It was also about the temperature. Paris in the late 18th century wasn't equipped with the kind of central heating systems we take for granted today. The rooms, while charming, could be quite cold, especially in the winter. People would bundle up in heavy layers, making their beds more of a nest than a place of peaceful slumber. But even with the layers of blankets, the cold was often hard to escape, especially when the air would seep through the cracks in the wooden shutters or the small windows of cramped apartments. For the wealthier citizens, sleeping in comfort was more attainable. They had larger, more luxurious beds, often draped with thick velvet curtains to block out the cold and noise. Their homes were often located in quieter neighborhoods, away from the clamor of the marketplace, and they could afford the luxury of privacy and peace. But for the majority of Parisians, sleep was something that required more work, both in terms of physical comfort and mental adjustment. As you lie there, surrounded by the sounds of the city, you realize that the act of sleep in 18th century Paris wasn't simply a biological need. It was a reflection of the time. The growth of urban life had brought with it a new set of challenges, but also a new way of living. The energy of the city, though exhausting at times, was also a symbol of progress and the shifting tides of history. Sleep, like everything else, was adapting to the new rhythm of life. And as you drift into sleep, you can't help but wonder what the future holds for the world's ever-changing relationship with rest. Now, let's turn our attention to the Viking Age, a time where sleep was often interrupted by the harsh realities of the world outside. Picture yourself in a small, drafty wooden longhouse. The fire is crackling in the hearth, and the smell of burning wood fills the air. You lie on a raised platform, with only a thin woolen blanket to keep you warm against the chill of the northern nights. The sounds of the night outside are punctuated by the occasional howling wind or the distant calls of wolves. The air is cold, and the floors are hard, but you close your eyes, knowing that rest is necessary if you are to survive another day of the brutal Viking lifestyle. In Viking society, sleep was something that had to be earned, fought for, and carefully guarded. The Vikings were warriors, sailors, and farmers, and their lives were filled with physical demands. Sleep was often a luxury they couldn't afford. The longhouse, a central feature of Viking living, was typically a crowded space. It served as a place for both work and rest, with families, animals, and even the occasional guest all sharing the same space. While you might have a designated spot to sleep, it was hardly private. Families slept together in close quarters, often with the warmth of the hearth keeping the air warm enough to survive the frigid temperatures. Historians still argue about how much rest the Vikings actually got. Some suggest that Viking sleep patterns were incredibly fragmented due to the demands of their unpredictable lives, while others believe that the Vikings adapted to the cold, dark winters with a more regular sleep schedule. But one thing is clear, Viking sleep was not restful in the way we experience it today. The hard wooden floors, the crowded spaces, and the constant noise of family members or animals made a peaceful, undisturbed sleep difficult to come by. Sleep wasn't just about comfort. It was also tied to Viking culture. Many Vikings believed that sleep had a mystical component, with dreams seen as messages from the gods. It wasn't unusual for a Viking to pray for dreams that could help them in battle, or that would reveal hidden knowledge. In fact, Vikings were incredibly superstitious about their dreams. A bad dream was seen as a sign of impending doom, while a good dream could be seen as a blessing. Sleep was, therefore, not only a time for rest but also for receiving divine messages. But sleep wasn't the only thing on the Vikings' minds. Their days were filled with activities that demanded energy, and they needed rest to keep up with the physical demands of their lives. Whether they were raiding distant shores, farming their land, or tending to their longboats, they needed every ounce of strength they could muster. So, in the midst of all their brutality and strength, sleep was seen as a vital form of recovery, even if it wasn't particularly comfortable or serene. Vikings also had to contend with the harshness of the seasons. The long, dark winters of Scandinavia often meant that there were fewer daylight hours for working, which led to a kind of forced rest. But even in the depths of winter, the need for warmth and shelter outweighed the desire for sleep. The longhouse, while offering some protection from the cold, was often overcrowded, and the warmth from the fire was hard to keep contained. Despite the cold and discomfort, sleep in these conditions was a vital part of Viking survival. In fact, some historians suggest that Vikings may have had a unique way of managing their sleep, using techniques that helped them cope with the long, dark nights. The Vikings, like other cultures in the northern latitudes, may have practiced segmented sleep, where they would sleep for a few hours, wake up in the middle of the night to pray or reflect, and then go back to sleep for a second period. This pattern allowed them to manage their limited daylight hours while also getting rest in a world that demanded constant vigilance. But despite the hardships, sleep played a crucial role in the Viking worldview. To them, sleep wasn't just about resting their bodies. It was about connecting with the spiritual world and preparing for the challenges ahead. Even though their beds were rudimentary, their dreams were believed to be as significant as the battles they fought or the boats they sailed. Sleep was a sacred ritual, a way to honor the gods and receive their guidance. And as you lie in your bed, surrounded by the sounds of your fellow Vikings and the crackling fire, you realize that sleep, in its own way, was as vital to the Viking warrior as any weapon in their arsenal. As you begin to drift off, you can't help but think about the ruggedness of it all. The discomfort of the hard floor beneath you, the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth, and the knowledge that sleep is not just for rest, but for preparing your soul for the battles to come. The world of the Vikings was harsh, but sleep, in its own way, was a form of preparation for whatever the gods had in store. Let's shift now to ancient Greece, where sleep was considered as much a philosophical experience as it was a physical necessity. Imagine yourself in a small, sparsely furnished room in Athens, the warm Mediterranean air drifting through the open window. Outside, you hear the sound of the marketplace, the chatter of merchants, and the occasional clatter of a chariot on the cobblestone streets. You've had a busy day, listening to the philosophical debates in the agora, perhaps spending some time with your fellow citizens in the baths. And now, as the sun sets, you find yourself lying down on a simple cot, made of straw and linen under a thin blanket. The flickering light of an oil lamp casts long shadows across the room as you prepare to sleep. In ancient Greece, sleep wasn't just a bodily function. It was deeply intertwined with religion, philosophy, and even politics. The Greeks viewed sleep as a state of semi-consciousness, a mysterious zone between wakefulness and the afterlife. They believed that during sleep, your soul would leave the body and travel to the realm of dreams. This journey was not only a time for rest, but also a time for spiritual renewal, where the gods might communicate with the sleeper through dreams. Historians still debate how much the ancient Greeks really understood about the physiological aspects of sleep. While they didn't have the scientific knowledge we have today, their ideas were often far ahead of their time in terms of spiritual and philosophical significance. Some Greek philosophers, including Aristotle, believed that dreams were a reflection of our desires and experiences, and could offer insight into our waking lives. Others, such as Hippocrates, the father of medicine, suggested that sleep had a more direct connection to the body's health, essential for restoring energy and maintaining good health. But for all the philosophical musings, sleep in ancient Greece was far from luxurious. People often slept on simple mattresses made of straw or wool, and only the wealthier citizens had access to more comfortable beds, which were made of wood and sometimes even adorned with cushions. The lower classes, meanwhile, might sleep on the floor, with their beds merely a thin layer of cloth over the hard ground. And although the Greeks enjoyed a relatively mild climate, the cold of the winter months made sleep uncomfortable for many, especially those who lived in the poorer sections of the city. The Greek practice of communal living also had an impact on sleep. While the wealthy could afford private sleeping chambers, the majority of Greeks slept in shared spaces. Homes, especially in the poorer districts, were often small and crowded. People might sleep in the same room as their family members, or even as their slaves, with little privacy. The concept of a personal sanctuary to sleep in, such as we know today, didn't exist. Instead, sleep was seen as something functional, something to be endured in order to wake up and perform the duties of the day. One of the most intriguing aspects of Greek sleep culture was their belief in the god Hypnos, the personification of sleep. Hypnos was depicted as a gentle, calm figure who would help people rest and rejuvenate. People would pray to Hypnos, asking for peaceful sleep and good dreams, and there were even temples dedicated to him. In fact, one of the most famous sanctuaries to Hypnos was located in the city of Epidaurus, where people would come to seek healing and rest. It was believed that sleep had the power to restore health, and many would visit these sanctuaries in the hopes that Hypnos would grant them healing dreams or provide relief from physical ailments. The Greeks also had a strong belief in the power of dreams. They didn't see sleep as just a time to rest, but as a time when the gods might communicate with them. Dream interpretation was a valued skill, and there were many texts and writings on how to interpret dreams. People would visit dream interpreters, hoping for guidance from the gods. Dreams were often seen as prophetic, a way for the divine to communicate messages about the future. In fact, some of the greatest events in Greek history, such as the rise of Alexander the Great, were said to have been influenced by dreams that were interpreted as divine messages. But as we know, sleep wasn't always peaceful. The poor sleep conditions in many Greek homes, combined with the constant bustle of the city, meant that sleep wasn't always restful. Noise, light, and the general activity of daily life could disrupt the natural rhythm of rest, making it harder to achieve the deep, rejuvenating sleep that the Greeks believed was so important for spiritual and physical health. Still, despite the hardships, sleep in ancient Greece was seen as a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. It was a time for reflection, for healing, and for receiving messages from the gods. In a world where the gods had a direct influence on every aspect of life, sleep was seen as a sacred time, not just for physical restoration, but for connecting with something greater. So, as you lie there in your simple cot, the flickering light of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, you might close your eyes and think of Hypnos, the god of sleep. In the quiet of the night, as your body begins to relax, you understand that sleep is not just an escape. It is a doorway to something more. It is a connection to the divine, a time when the soul leaves the body and travels to a place of dreams and prophecy. Let's now journey back to the medieval period. But this time, we're exploring a different kind of sleep, the sleep of the nobility. Imagine yourself in a grand stone castle, the air cool but not unbearable, with the scent of burning wood from the hearth filling the vast hall. You lie in a massive four-poster bed, draped with rich tapestries and cushions, beneath a heavy quilted blanket. The flickering firelight from the hearth casts long shadows across the walls, and the castle is eerily quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. You may think of it as the perfect sleep setting, but as we will see, medieval nobility's sleep wasn't as glamorous as it might seem. The wealthy and powerful in the Middle Ages had far more comfort than the peasants or workers, and their beds were certainly much more lavish. They slept on raised platforms with feather-filled mattresses, often layered with linen sheets, woolen blankets, and fur coverings. But don't be fooled by this seemingly cozy arrangement. Despite the luxury of their bedding, the noble's sleep was not free from discomfort. Medieval castles were drafty, and their stone walls, while sturdy, were not conducive to warmth. The wind could howl through the cracks, making the nights chilly even with the finest bedclothes. Historians still debate how well medieval nobility really slept. While the upper classes had access to better sleeping arrangements, their sleep patterns were often interrupted by the realities of their lifestyle. The most important aspect of medieval noble sleep was that it was governed by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of their social roles. Nobles often rose at dawn, but they also had an afternoon nap. This habit of siesta was part of their daily routine, not just for physical rest, but also as a social custom. Their beds were not just places of rest, they were ceremonial spaces. The grand four-poster beds that we imagine in castles were often used for public purposes as well. For example, a noble might entertain guests in their chambers, and the bed might serve as the focal point of a social gathering. Imagine lounging in a lavishly appointed room, surrounded by tapestries and flickering candlelight, as the noble reclines on a bed that serves as both a place of rest and a symbol of status. While you're technically in the middle of a sleeping space, you're not exactly left to sleep in private. The idea of having a restful, undisturbed night's sleep in medieval nobility was an unusual luxury, and they didn't enjoy the quiet solitude we're accustomed to today. Another curious aspect of noble sleep was the presence of servants and attendants. A noble might sleep with the door to their chamber open, attended to by servants who brought them food, drink, or even kept watch over them through the night. In fact, some nobles believed in sleeping with attendants as a safety measure, ensuring they were protected against any threat that might arise in the night, such as assassins or marauders. Even in their most private space, nobles were surrounded by the trappings of power and responsibility, and sleep was no exception. This need for security could interrupt their rest, as they were constantly aware of their position and the dangers that came with it. And then, of course, there was the issue of lighting. Medieval nobles relied on candles and oil lamps to light their chambers, but even these were less than perfect. The flickering candlelight provided little comfort, especially during the long, dark winter nights. The smell of burning tallow from the candles filled the room, and the smoke would sometimes make the air feel heavy, almost suffocating. This dim lighting, while adding a certain romantic ambience to the room, was hardly conducive to a restful night's sleep. It was also a constant chore to keep the candles burning, as they needed to be replaced and tended to regularly. Much like the rest of medieval life, sleep was something that required constant maintenance. The temperature was another factor that affected noble sleep. Castles were often cold, even in the wealthiest homes, and heating was primitive at best. Fireplaces provided some warmth, but the heat rarely reached the far corners of the room, especially in the larger halls. So while you might sleep in a richly adorned bed, the cold could still seep in, making sleep uncomfortable. It's not exactly the warm, cozy sleep we associate with modern life. Despite these challenges, the medieval noble's sleep was still a world apart from that of peasants. While peasants slept in cramped, communal spaces, sometimes even with animals, and endured the harshness of cold floors and straw mattresses, the nobility had the luxury of better comfort, more privacy, and a higher degree of personal security. But their sleep was far from peaceful. It was interrupted by the noise of servants, the chill of the stone walls, and the ever-present knowledge of their social status and its demands. The idea of a restful, uninterrupted sleep in the way we think of it today was a rare thing for everyone in the medieval world. As you lay there in your grand bed, trying to relax in the flickering candlelight, you can't help but feel the weight of responsibility, of position, and the nagging chill that surrounds you. It's a different kind of unrest, one that only those in power might know. The bed, while richly adorned and luxurious, cannot truly offer the peace that sleep should bring. In a way, the medieval noble's sleep, despite the grandeur, is a reminder that comfort is not always synonymous with rest. Now, let's take a moment to explore the practice of sleep in the ancient world, focusing on Rome once more, but this time looking at the daily lives of its peasants. Picture yourself in a humble Roman home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood far from the opulence of the emperor's palace. The room you sleep in is small and sparsely furnished, with only the bare essentials. A simple straw mattress, a rough woolen blanket, and perhaps a few personal items scattered around the space. The floor is cold, and the air is thick with the smell of earth and clay. The only warmth you get is from the small hearth in the corner, where a modest fire burns low into the night. Roman peasants, unlike the wealthy who could afford lavish beds and rooms of their own, slept in a much more utilitarian way. The beds were usually very basic, nothing more than a frame with a mattress stuffed with straw or hay, covered by simple linen or woolen blankets. You might think of it as little more than a place to rest after a long day of hard labor. But in truth, sleep for the Roman peasant was more about survival than luxury. You didn't get much choice when it came to the conditions of your sleep. The hard floor beneath you might be your bed for the night, or perhaps you'd sleep in a corner of the home where the family gathered for warmth. Historians still argue about the exact nature of sleep in ancient Rome, especially among the lower classes. Some suggest that the poor slept in shifts, perhaps due to cramped living spaces or the need to keep watch over property or animals. Others believe that, like today, sleep was relatively undisturbed but in a much less comfortable setting. What is clear is that sleep was a function of necessity. People didn't have the luxury of deciding when to rest based on their preferences. If you were tired, you slept. If you had to get up early to work, you'd rise as soon as the sun came up, regardless of how well you'd slept the night before. The Roman peasant's sleep was also dictated by the rhythms of nature. Without artificial light, the day was governed by the sun. People woke with the sunrise and worked until nightfall. When it got dark, they would retire to their homes, often without much ceremony. The Roman villa or insula, apartment, where a peasant lived was often poorly ventilated, and the lack of windows meant that rooms were dark even during the day. Without the luxury of light to extend their work or leisure time, Roman peasants went to sleep soon after the evening meal, and their sleep, though necessary for recovery, wasn't much more than a brief pause before the demands of another day. While the wealthy Roman elite enjoyed grand villas with intricately designed sleeping chambers, complete with plush bedding and lavish furniture, the peasants were not afforded such comforts. Many slept in common areas with their families or other members of their community. They may have even shared the space with animals, as some homes included small stalls for livestock. For a peasant, privacy was nearly non-existent, and the quality of sleep was likely less restful due to the proximity of others, the noise of daily life, and the lack of personal space. The practice of communal sleeping was not just a feature of Roman peasantry. It was a necessity. In the Roman world, where many people lived in overcrowded conditions and worked long, grueling hours, Sleep became something that had to be squeezed into whatever space was available. But even within these rough conditions, Roman peasants understood the value of rest. Despite the hard work of the day, they knew that sleep was essential to their survival, even if it wasn't the restful, peaceful sleep we often think of today. But what about the dreams of Roman peasants? Were they as essential as sleep itself? In ancient Rome, dreams were seen as an important part of life. Romans believed that dreams were a form of communication from the gods, offering guidance or foretelling the future. In fact, many Romans kept dream journals and consulted dream interpreters to make sense of the messages they received while sleeping. The humble peasant, despite the simplicity of their life, might still turn to a priest or soothsayer to interpret their dreams, hoping that the gods would send them important information about their future. Dreams were believed to offer insight into everything from health to matters of love, and a bad dream was often seen as a warning sign. The gods themselves were thought to communicate through dreams, and temples were dedicated to various deities who were believed to give guidance through sleep. Some historians suggest that the Romans believed that the gods could either bless or curse an individual through their dreams, influencing their fortunes in the waking world. So, even though your bed might be little more than a straw mat on the floor, sleep held a much deeper significance. It was a connection to the divine, a space where the human and the divine could interact. In the end, Roman peasant sleep was not about comfort or luxury. It was about survival, getting enough rest to face another day of work. Yet, even within these humble circumstances, sleep had its own kind of sacredness. It was a time for the body to heal and for the gods to communicate. Dreams, even those experienced by the poor, were seen as valuable insights into the world beyond. And so, as you close your eyes on your hard straw mat in your humble home, you might wonder if the gods have sent you a message in your sleep, or if, like so many before you are simply resting to face another long day. Let's now travel to the harsh yet intriguing world of ancient Egypt, where the concept of sleep and rest took on a unique and culturally significant role. Picture yourself lying on a raised, wooden platform inside a modest Egyptian home. The air is warm and dry, with the faint scent of incense drifting from a nearby burner. The soft sounds of the bustling marketplace outside filter through your small window, but inside your room, there's a sense of calm. The room is simply furnished, with a small chest for your belongings, a woven mat on the floor, and a thin linen sheet covering you. Despite the simplicity of your surroundings, there's a certain comfort in the warmth of the desert night, and the weight of the day's hard labor slips away as you prepare for sleep. Unlike the cold stone of medieval castles or the cramped conditions of Roman apartments, ancient Egyptian sleep was often defined by the warmth of the climate and the relative simplicity of the furniture. Egyptian beds were typically raised off the ground and made of wood or stone, with a flat surface covered by simple cushions or linen. In wealthy homes, these beds might be more lavish, adorned with rich materials and finer fabrics, but for the average person, the focus was on practicality and comfort rather than luxury. Historians still debate how comfortable ancient Egyptian beds truly were, as many of these raised platforms were hard, providing little cushioning for the body. However, the Egyptians' focus was not on achieving deep, uninterrupted sleep, but rather on the restorative nature of rest. The warmth of the desert nights, combined with the physical exhaustion of working the land or serving the pharaoh, meant that sleep, though necessary, was never a priority for lavish indulgence. For most Egyptians, the bed was simply a place to rest before the next day's labor began. Sleep in ancient Egypt also had strong spiritual and cultural significance. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul could leave the body during sleep and travel to the realm of dreams. This idea was deeply tied to their religious beliefs about the afterlife. The concept of the Ka, the life force, and the Ba, the soul, were central to Egyptian thought, and sleep was considered a time when the soul could leave the body and connect with the gods. In fact, many Egyptians practiced rituals before sleep, hoping that their dreams would bring them guidance or prophetic visions. The Egyptians were also known for their belief in the power of dreams. Dreams were seen as a direct communication from the gods, and people would consult priests or dream interpreters to understand their meanings. Dream interpretation was a highly respected practice in ancient Egypt, and the results were often seen as divine messages, offering insight into the future or guidance for making important decisions. A dream could signal everything from personal health to the well-being of the entire community. Those who experienced vivid dreams might be considered to have a special connection with the divine. But sleep in Egypt was also influenced by the physical environment. The harshness of the climate, extreme heat during the day, followed by cooler, dry nights, made rest crucial. During the summer months, people would often sleep on rooftops or in open courtyards, seeking the cool desert air after a long, hot day. But even with the outdoor sleeping arrangements, the Egyptians had to contend with the pests of the desert: mosquitoes, sandflies, and other insects that would disrupt their rest. Despite this, the importance of sleep as a time for rejuvenation and connection to the gods remained central to Egyptian culture. Even in the modest homes of ordinary Egyptians, sleep was not just a time for rest but a sacred act. The Egyptians had specific rituals before sleep, including prayers to the gods for peaceful rest and good dreams. They often used incense or oils to help create a soothing atmosphere, believing that the right smells and offerings could invite the gods into their dreams. These rituals helped create an environment of calm, which was essential for ensuring that the soul was ready to leave the body and journey through the realms of dreams. Sleep in ancient Egypt was also closely tied to the concept of healing. The Egyptians understood the importance of physical rest for recovery, but they also believed that rest had a more profound role in restoring the soul. Sleep was seen as a time when the body could heal itself, and in many ways it was a spiritual act, a process of renewing the body and soul. For the priests and priestesses who served the gods, sleep was an essential part of their daily routine, ensuring that they could serve their spiritual duties with clarity and strength. But for those living outside the temples and palaces, sleep was much more mundane. It was a brief escape from the exhausting work of the day, a chance to recover physically and mentally. Yet even in these humble conditions, the connection to the divine was never far. The Egyptians believed that sleep could offer insight, peace, and connection to the gods, and the rituals surrounding it helped maintain a sense of order in their lives. As you lie there, preparing for rest, you can't help but think about the profound connection between sleep, dreams, and the divine. In a world so attuned to the spiritual, sleep wasn't just a time for recovery. It was a sacred ritual that bridged the mortal world and the divine. And as you close your eyes, you might wonder what messages the gods will send you through your dreams, hoping that tonight's rest will bring you the guidance or strength you need to face another day in the ever-present heat of the desert. Now, let's move to the frigid and unforgiving world of the Viking Age once again. Imagine yourself in the midst of a long, harsh winter, tucked inside a small, dimly lit longhouse. The air is cold, the smell of wood smoke clings to everything, and the wind howls outside, rattling the wooden walls. You've just finished a hearty meal of meat and bread, your stomach full but still aching from the day's labor. You're lying on a simple bed, likely little more than a pile of fur and straw, a rough woolen blanket barely keeping you warm. It's not a comfortable place, but it's what you have, and sleep is a necessary respite from the cold and hard work that defines Viking life. Viking sleep, like many aspects of their culture, was shaped by their environment. The long, dark winters of Scandinavia meant that nights could stretch on for hours, leaving little to do but rest. However, sleep in the Viking world wasn't about comfort or luxury. Most people lived in small, one-room longhouses, where the family shared the space with their livestock. Privacy was scarce, and the noise of the animals or the restless movements of others could easily interrupt a peaceful night's rest. Historians still argue about the sleep patterns of Vikings, particularly whether their sleep was more segmented, like the sleep habits of many pre-industrial societies. There's evidence suggesting that Vikings, like other northern cultures, may have practiced biphasic sleep, sleeping in 2 shifts. One segment would occur in the early evening, and then there would be a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, often for prayer or even socializing. After this brief period of wakefulness, they would sleep again until morning. The colder, darker nights would make this type of segmented sleep particularly useful, as it allowed people to rest for a while before resuming their tasks. However, it's also clear that sleep for the Vikings was not something to be taken lightly. The Viking lifestyle, with its constant threats of raids, battles, and harsh weather required vigilance. Even during the night, some might have kept watch, ensuring that their community remained safe from outside threats. While Viking warriors were often seen as fearless and strong, sleep was still an essential part of their survival, giving them the energy needed for their next raid or battle. Even in the more peaceful periods of their lives, Viking sleep was shaped by their warrior culture. The Vikings believed that sleep was a time for the soul to rest and rejuvenate. They didn't see sleep merely as a physical necessity, but as something that could affect their spiritual and mental well-being. They also believed in dreams, which were seen as messages from the gods or glimpses into the future. Dreams played an important role in Viking society, and they were often interpreted as signs, warnings, or prophecies. Some believed that the gods themselves visited in dreams, offering guidance or warnings about impending battles or events. One of the more intriguing aspects of Viking sleep is their relationship with their gods during the night. In Viking mythology, sleep was connected to their spiritual practices. The Norse gods, like Odin and Freya, were believed to communicate through dreams, and many Viking warriors would pray before sleep, hoping for visions that would help them in battle or provide guidance for their lives. The Vikings were not just physical warriors, they were spiritual warriors as well, and sleep was part of their overall preparation for the challenges they faced. As you lie on your bed, bundled in furs and listening to the wind howl outside, you might wonder how much the Vikings believed their dreams would influence their fate. Was it the gods speaking to them in their sleep, or were dreams simply a reflection of their own fears and desires? The Viking mindset was deeply intertwined with their connection to the supernatural, and sleep was an important part of that. But despite the spiritual and cultural significance of sleep in Viking society, the physical realities of sleeping in a Viking longhouse were far from comfortable. The cold stone and wood of the house made sleep a challenge, and the lack of privacy and the presence of livestock only added to the discomfort. The Vikings were known for their resilience, and sleep, while essential, was not a luxury. It was a functional part of their lives. The longhouse, with its communal living, was a symbol of Viking culture, close-knit, practical, and centered around survival. Sleep was a part of that survival, allowing the Vikings to rest and recuperate before facing the hardships of the next day. The idea of personal space or restful sleep was secondary to the needs of the tribe or family. While the nobility in Viking society may have had better accommodations, the average Viking had to make do with what they had, finding warmth and rest amidst the harshest conditions. As you drift off to sleep in your longhouse, surrounded by your family and livestock, you realize that this sleep is not just a time to rest. It's a time for connection. Connection to the gods, connection to your family, and connection to your own resilience. The night may be long and cold, but the promise of a new day, filled with challenges and the potential for greatness, is always just beyond the horizon. Now, let's venture into the lives of the medieval peasants, who were the backbone of their society, yet their sleep was often as harsh as the conditions they lived in. Imagine yourself in a small, dimly lit cottage in the countryside. The air is cold, and the hearth in the center of the room is nothing more than a small fire that flickers weakly, struggling to ward off the chill of the early evening. You lie on a straw mattress, covered with a coarse woolen blanket. The floor beneath you is cold, hard, and uneven, and the walls of your cottage, made of simple timber, creak in the wind. There's no luxury here, just a simple bed and the promise of sleep that's much needed after a long day of hard labor. In medieval times, peasants didn't have the luxury of comfortable mattresses or warm, private rooms. Their homes were simple, often one-room structures shared with animals. The floor, typically made of dirt or stone, served as both living space and sleeping area. Families slept together, huddling for warmth in crowded quarters, with sometimes little more than a woolen blanket separating one person from another. The rough, hard surfaces of their beds made sleep a struggle, and a peaceful night's rest was a rarity. Historians still debate the quality of sleep for peasants in the medieval period. While some believe that these harsh conditions contributed to widespread sleep deprivation, others suggest that peasants were simply accustomed to these challenging environments. In many ways, sleep was just another part of the daily grind. After long hours of labor, Whether working the fields, tending to animals, or preparing food, peasants would collapse into bed, exhausted but often not in the most comfortable conditions. This form of sleeping on the job, so to speak, was a result of both necessity and habit. With little space and fewer comforts, the concept of restful sleep wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. The medieval workday, especially during planting and harvest seasons, left little time for rest. Peasants would often rise with the sun, working hard throughout the day, and collapse into bed as soon as they could. The limited hours of daylight meant that their time for rest was brief, and it was common for peasants to work well into the evening, sometimes by candlelight, before going to sleep. Even their night was often fragmented. In many cases, sleep was broken into two periods, known as segmented sleep. The first sleep would begin after dark, and after a few hours, they would wake up for a brief period in the middle of the night. During this time, some might pray, talk, or even work for a short while, before returning to sleep for the second stretch until morning. This pattern was common in much of the medieval world, before artificial lighting changed the nature of sleep. But despite the hardship of their daily lives, peasants also had a strong sense of community. The shared experience of sleeping together in cramped quarters, enduring the same difficulties and hardships, created a bond among them. Sleep, though not always comfortable or restful, was a shared experience, and in many ways, it helped to reinforce social ties within these tight-knit communities. This communal aspect of sleep was an integral part of medieval life, whether it was huddling together for warmth or finding solace in the company of others during the long winter nights. There was also a spiritual aspect to sleep in medieval peasant life. While the nobility had the luxury of private chambers and religious rituals before rest, peasants would often turn to prayer before bed, seeking protection and comfort from God. The medieval world was deeply religious, and peasants often relied on their faith for comfort in the face of hardship. They would pray for a restful sleep and for protection from evil spirits, sickness, and the hardships of the coming day. Nighttime was considered a vulnerable time, with evil spirits and demons believed to roam more freely in the dark hours. People would place charms, crosses, or religious symbols by their beds to ward off these dangers. Despite the discomfort and uncertainty of their rest, sleep was still a much-needed reprieve from the trials of daily life. In the quiet of the night, peasants had an opportunity to disconnect from the burdens of their labor, even if only for a few hours. This small escape from the demands of the day was vital for their resilience, giving them the strength they needed to rise early and face another challenging day. While the medieval peasant's bed was far from luxurious, it was a place of rest, a brief but necessary pause in an otherwise grueling existence. It wasn't the soft, comfortable beds of the wealthy, but it was functional. The very simplicity of it, straw-filled mattresses, rough blankets, shared spaces, reinforced the idea that rest was a basic human need, not a luxury. In this way, sleep for the medieval peasant wasn't just about comfort or personal pleasure. It was a way of recovering physically and mentally from the intense labor required to survive. And as you lie there, in the cool dark of your humble cottage, with the fire crackling and the wind howling outside, you realize that this is more than just sleep. It's a moment of peace, however fleeting, a moment when the world outside can wait, and you can rest before tomorrow's struggles begin. It's the simplicity of life in its rawest form, and sleep is one of the few places where you can find respite from it all. Let's step away from the harsh realities of the northern lands and shift to the luxurious and ornate world of the Roman elite. Imagine yourself in a grand villa in the heart of Rome, the sun setting over the Mediterranean, casting golden light across your sprawling estate. The air is warm and filled with the scent of blooming flowers from the gardens, and the sounds of a lively dinner party echo from the atrium. You retire to your private chambers, where an elaborately draped four-poster bed awaits, cushioned with the finest linens, wool, and perhaps even down feathers. The bed is raised, supported by intricately carved wooden legs, and beside it, a small fire burns low in a brazier, filling the room with warmth. Roman sleep, especially for the upper class, was an entirely different experience from that of the peasant class. While the working class may have slept on straw mats or in crowded quarters, the wealthy Romans enjoyed beds of luxury, with imported cushions and fine linens. The elite also had their own private rooms, separate from the bustling parts of the house where servants and family members would sleep. Roman villas, particularly in the countryside, were expansive, and sleep for the elite was not just about rest. It was a moment of privacy, comfort, and reflection. Historians still debate whether the Romans' concept of sleep was as restful as we imagine it to be. The opulence of the elite's sleeping arrangements didn't necessarily equate to better sleep quality. Roman beds, though lavish, were often quite hard, offering little in terms of modern comfort. Cushions filled with feathers or wool were placed on top of wooden frames, but they were far from the plush, soft mattresses we use today. In fact, many ancient Roman beds were designed for posture rather than comfort, with a focus on supporting the body in a way that aligned with Roman views on health and well-being. What is clear, however, is that Roman elites placed a great deal of importance on sleep, and they saw it as a time for both physical and mental rejuvenation. In a society where public life was all-encompassing, where you could not escape the gaze of others, whether in the Senate, at the baths, or in the marketplace, sleep offered a rare opportunity for solitude and privacy. Even though the elite lived in grandeur, their daily lives were filled with duties and responsibilities. The time they spent resting was precious, as it allowed them to prepare for the rigorous demands of their public and private lives. But sleep in ancient Rome was not simply a personal affair. It was part of the larger rhythms of Roman society. Romans slept in two phases: a first sleep, which would begin at sunset, and then a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. The practice of segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep, was common in ancient Rome. After the first sleep, many Romans would wake up for an hour or two to attend to personal matters, read, socialize, or engage in quiet reflection. Then they would return to sleep until morning. This middle-of-the-night wakefulness might seem strange to us today, but it was a normal part of Roman life. It was believed that this break in sleep allowed people to digest their thoughts, have private moments of reflection, or even receive divine messages through dreams. Roman elites, particularly those with a lot of wealth and leisure time, often had access to dream interpreters and soothsayers, much like the Egyptians. Dreams were seen as significant messages from the gods, and it was common for Romans to seek interpretations of their dreams to make important life decisions. In fact, the Romans had a deeply ingrained belief in the power of dreams to shape their destinies. The famous philosopher Artemidorus wrote a detailed guide to dream interpretation, emphasizing that certain dreams were omens of things to come. For the Roman elite, sleep was not just about recovering from the day's activities. It was a spiritual experience, intertwined with their belief in divine communication. For the wealthy Romans, their beds were also a statement of status and a way to demonstrate their wealth and sophistication. They adorned their bedrooms with frescoes, sculptures, and beautiful furniture, creating spaces that were not just for rest, but for leisure and socializing. Beds became focal points of a Roman villa, often surrounded by artwork, fine textiles, and sometimes even exotic plants. Sleep was tied to status, and the luxury of a private space to sleep and rest was an integral part of Roman elite culture. Yet, despite these luxurious sleeping conditions, the restless nature of Roman life often made sleep a bit more elusive than we might think. The sounds of the city, the calls of slaves, the constant demands of public life, it all made true rest difficult to achieve. The wealthy may have had the best beds and the most comfortable settings, but they, too, faced the pressures of Roman society. As much as the elite sought comfort in their private chambers, the societal pressures to perform, to lead, and to entertain would often disrupt their peace. As you lie on your elegant bed, with the cool Mediterranean night air drifting through the open windows, you might reflect on the strange tension that sleep represented in the Roman world. It was at once a time of personal relaxation, but also of societal expectations and spiritual reflection. The bed beneath you is more than a place for sleep. It is a symbol of your place in the social hierarchy, a testament to your wealth, and perhaps a reminder of the gods' influence on your dreams. In the end, the Romans may have had the finest beds, but sleep was never an escape from the weight of responsibility. It was a reprieve, certainly, but even in their most luxurious chambers, the elite of Rome could not fully escape the demands of the world around them. As the night deepens and the sounds of the villa quiet down, you close your eyes, knowing that rest will come. But so too will the responsibilities of another busy day in the heart of one of the world's greatest civilizations. Let's now journey forward to the Victorian era once again, but this time we're exploring the experience of sleep for the working class. Picture yourself in a small, cramped room at the top of a poorly built Victorian house. The walls thin and the floorboards creaky beneath you. The room is barely furnished. A simple iron bed frame with a thin, lumpy mattress rests in the corner, and a small window barely lets in the faintest sliver of light. The air is stuffy, and the faint smell of coal smoke clings to everything. It's late at night, and while you've had a long, exhausting day working in the factories, your sleep is anything but restful. Victorian working-class sleep was shaped by the harsh realities of industrial life. With long hours in grim factories or exhausting manual labor, rest was a necessity, yet not always easily achieved. The working class did not have the luxury of spacious bedrooms or soft beds. Instead, they slept in overcrowded, poorly ventilated rooms, often with multiple people in one room. These conditions made it difficult for them to achieve the restful, uninterrupted sleep we often take for granted today. But even in these harsh conditions, sleep was an essential escape, a brief respite from the grueling work that awaited the next day. Historians still debate how much sleep the Victorian working class actually got. Some suggest that the exhaustion of factory work and other labor meant that workers could fall into a deep, though brief, sleep as soon as they lay down. Others argue that the constant noise of industrial life, from the clanging of machines to the constant activity outside their homes, made it difficult to sleep soundly. In truth, sleep in Victorian working-class neighborhoods was likely fragmented and disturbed, leaving people constantly fatigued, even when they did manage to sleep. The working hours of the Victorian era were brutal, with factory workers, especially children, often working 12 to 16 hours a day. This left little time for sleep, and when workers finally had a moment to rest, their beds were far from restful. The majority of the working class slept on narrow iron bed frames, often sharing with siblings or even parents. Bedding was minimal, thin mattresses filled with straw or cotton that flattened over time, and a small pillow, if there was one, offered little support. Many of these rooms were cramped, shared with several people, and poorly lit, making it difficult to rest properly. While the wealthy Victorians enjoyed spacious, comfortable bedrooms, many of them filled with velvet drapes and large feather beds, the working class had no such luxury. Their sleep environments were crowded, noisy, and uncomfortable. The lack of personal space and the cold, damp air of poorly insulated homes further hindered sleep. And with little in the way of modern conveniences, they often had to contend with the sounds of street traffic, factory machinery, and neighbors late into the night. The working class in Victorian London, for example, often lived in the infamous rookery districts, overcrowded, unsanitary areas filled with cramped tenements. These spaces lacked privacy, heating, and basic hygiene, making sleep a difficult experience. The stench of human waste, coal, and industrial runoff filled the air, and the constant bustle of the city never truly stopped. Even in the dead of night, the sound of horse-drawn carts, the cries of children, and the clamor of street vendors was a constant reminder that the world outside was unforgiving. Yet, despite these harsh conditions, sleep was still essential. It was the only way to recharge the body for another day of labor. For many, sleep was not a choice but a necessity to survive. There were few comforts to be found in working-class homes, but rest was one of the few reprieves from the toil of everyday life. Some workers would sleep in shifts, with multiple family members occupying the same room at different times. For instance, one person would rest while another worked, maximizing the limited space available. Sleep was also a time for dreaming, though for the Victorian working class, dreams were often filled with hopes for escape or a better future. While the elite might have had the luxury of nightgowns and spacious, decorated rooms, the working class often sought solace in their dreams, which were filled with visions of better times. Sleep wasn't just a physical necessity for them. It was an emotional escape, a brief moment when the pressures of their lives could be put aside, even if just for a few hours. For many, sleep in Victorian times was an act of endurance. It was a way to recover from the relentless pace of the day's work, to gather enough strength for the next round of labor. And in the morning, before the sun even rose, the factory whistle would blow, signaling the start of another long day. With no time to waste, workers would roll out of their uncomfortable beds and get ready to face another exhausting shift. Sleep was a fleeting respite, something that was too often interrupted by the demands of the Industrial Revolution. The Victorian working-class sleep experience was one of both physical and emotional endurance. Despite the discomfort and the overcrowded conditions, sleep was a precious commodity. The difficulty of finding rest in the chaos of industrial life only made sleep more valuable, a necessary escape from the hardships of the day. And though the poor sleep conditions could not be ignored, they did not deter the workers from rising early every morning, determined to face whatever the next day brought. As you lie there, on your thin mattress in a crowded room, the hum of the city outside fading into the background, you realize that, despite everything, sleep remains your one true respite. Tomorrow, the grind will start again, but for now, you rest, knowing that sleep is one of the few moments when the world feels a little quieter, a little more bearable. Now, let's turn back the clock a bit and explore the sleep habits of the ancient Egyptians, where rest took on both a functional and deeply spiritual significance. Imagine yourself in a modest home along the banks of the Nile, the sound of the river gently flowing in the background. The air is warm, thick with the scent of incense, as the last light of the day fades behind the towering pyramids in the distance. Inside your home, the bed is simple, just a raised wooden frame covered with linen or papyrus mats. A thin linen sheet is draped over you, and the air is cool enough, but the weight of the day's labor lingers in your bones. You're exhausted from the scorching heat, the long hours in the fields, and the task of managing your household. But sleep, is the only chance for recovery. Ancient Egyptian sleep was far from the comfort we often imagine today. While pharaohs slept on luxurious beds adorned with fine linens and pillows, the common folk slept on more basic setups. These beds were often wooden frames or reed mats placed on the floor, with a layer of cushions or blankets to provide a little comfort. But what these simple sleeping arrangements lacked in comfort, they made up for in spiritual significance. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, sleep wasn't just a time for physical restoration. It was a portal for connecting with the divine. Historians still debate the exact nature of sleep in ancient Egypt. Some suggest that, like in many ancient cultures, sleep was seen as a time for the soul to journey beyond the body. Egyptians believed that during sleep, the soul left the body to travel, and the dreams that accompanied sleep were considered significant messages from the gods or from the realm of the afterlife. This connection between sleep and the soul was central to their spiritual beliefs. As you lie on your bed, ready to sleep, you might believe that your soul is preparing to leave the body, to journey into the realm of dreams, where it might receive divine messages. The connection between sleep and dreams was vital in ancient Egyptian culture. The Egyptians believed that the gods communicated with people through dreams. High-ranking priests and even the pharaohs themselves would often consult dream interpreters to understand the meanings of their dreams, as they were considered messages from the gods or omens about the future. Some dreams were believed to predict important events, while others were thought to provide guidance on personal or political matters. For the common people, however, dreams were often seen as reflections of their desires, fears, or personal experiences, though still connected to the spiritual realm. One of the most famous examples of dream interpretation in ancient Egypt is found in the story of the dream of Pharaoh Thutmose IV. According to Egyptian lore, Thutmose IV fell asleep in the shadow of the Great Sphinx and had a dream in which the Sphinx spoke to him, telling him to clear the sand surrounding the monument. This dream was interpreted as a divine message, and when Thutmose IV eventually carried out the task, he was rewarded with great success in his reign. For the Egyptians, dreams were not merely random occurrences, but rather divine communications that held deep meaning. But sleep in ancient Egypt wasn't just about the spiritual connection to the gods. It was also about physical restoration, especially after long, grueling days of hard work. The ancient Egyptians were deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature, with their daily activities closely following the cycles of the sun. Their days were long, starting at dawn with work in the fields or the temples, and often stretching late into the evening. This meant that by the time they went to bed, they were exhausted and in need of rest. Sleep, then, was an essential part of recovery, allowing the body to heal and prepare for another day of work. Interestingly, the Egyptians also had a practice that would be considered unusual by modern standards. They often took naps during the day. The intense heat of the afternoon, combined with the physical demands of their daily work, made it common for Egyptians to rest in the heat of midday, when the sun was at its peak. These short naps, or siestas, were a crucial part of the Egyptian workday, allowing the body to regain strength for the second half of the day's labor. Sleep, then, was not just an individual experience. It was deeply embedded in the social and spiritual fabric of ancient Egyptian life. From the simplest peasants to the pharaohs themselves, sleep was a time for physical and spiritual rejuvenation. The idea of rest, though perhaps not as comfortable as we imagine it today, was central to maintaining the health and well-being of the people. Whether it was the common worker resting from a long day's toil or the pharaoh seeking divine messages in his dreams, sleep was a time of connection to the divine and a crucial part of life. As you prepare for rest in your modest Egyptian home, the world outside is quieting down. The hustle of the day is over, and the sounds of the Nile are all that remains. You close your eyes, letting the warmth of the night comfort you, knowing that sleep is not just a physical necessity, but a sacred ritual that connects you to the gods, the past, and the future. Perhaps tonight, you'll dream of the gods, or perhaps you'll receive guidance for the challenges ahead. In the quiet of your bed, surrounded by the simple comforts of life, you understand that sleep is not just an escape. It is a bridge to something greater, something divine. A time when your soul can leave the body and wander through realms beyond, communicating with the gods, receiving their wisdom, and preparing for the days to come. As we continue our journey through time, let's head to ancient Rome once more. But this time, we'll focus on the average Roman citizen. A stark contrast to the grand bedrooms and luxurious beds of emperors and the elite. Picture yourself in a modest Roman insula, a kind of apartment building, located in the bustling heart of the city. It's a warm evening, and the sounds of the crowded streets, shouts from vendors, the rumble of carts, the hum of everyday life, filter through your window. Inside your small room, there's little space for anything more than a simple bed frame, some coarse woolen blankets, and a few personal items scattered about. The bed is small, barely large enough for you to stretch out, and it's nothing more than a rough wooden frame with a thin straw mattress. The air is warm but filled with the smell of the street, and you know sleep won't come easily tonight. Sleep in ancient Rome, for the common folk, was a necessity but not a luxury. Unlike the elite who enjoyed lavish furnishings and private quarters, the average Roman lived in cramped, crowded conditions. The insulae, the apartment buildings where most Romans lived, were overcrowded with little to no privacy. These buildings, often poorly constructed, lacked ventilation, and were filled with noise, making it hard to find a peaceful moment of rest. The beds were simple and uncomfortable, usually made from wooden frames and stuffed with straw or reeds, offering minimal support. Privacy, of course, was a luxury few could afford, and most families or individuals slept in the same room, often sharing their space with animals and personal belongings. Historians still debate how much sleep the average Roman really got. While it's known that the Roman workday was long, stretching from dawn to dusk, it's believed that many Romans managed to sleep in segmented patterns, much like other ancient cultures. They often went to bed shortly after sunset, slept for a few hours, then woke up during the night for a period of wakefulness before returning to sleep until morning. This interrupted sleep schedule was practical. Without the luxury of artificial lighting, the long, dark nights forced people to adjust their sleep patterns to make the most of the natural light. People would wake during the night to socialize, pray, or perform household tasks. This biphasic sleep pattern was a cultural norm, allowing Romans to rest and still make use of the long hours of darkness. But despite the practical reasons for segmented sleep, it was hardly ideal. The noise from the streets, the smells of the overcrowded apartment, and the lack of privacy made it difficult for many Romans to achieve the kind of restful sleep we might take for granted. Those who lived near the busy marketplaces or in lower-class districts like the Subura, often had to contend with the constant clamor of the city, the sound of horse-drawn carts, the chatter of neighbors, and the occasional argument in the street. The cramped conditions of Roman living meant that even sleep was a communal activity, and restful moments were hard to come by. Romans also had to contend with the physical discomfort of their sleeping arrangements. While the wealthy might have slept on large, feather-stuffed beds with luxurious linens, the common people of Rome slept on thin straw mattresses, which offered little more than a basic layer of padding against the hard floor. Blankets were often coarse and uncomfortable, and the temperature could be an issue. The insulae, being poorly constructed, were subject to both extreme heat and cold, and without proper insulation, the temperature inside these buildings could fluctuate wildly. In the heat of summer, the rooms could become stifling, while winter brought the chill of the stone walls into the rooms, making sleep a constant battle against discomfort. Despite these hardships, sleep in ancient Rome wasn't all about endurance. Romans placed significant importance on the idea of rest and rejuvenation. The idea of odium, or leisure, was tied to the concept of recovery, both physical and mental. Sleep, as part of this rest, was necessary for people to maintain their strength for work, combat, and public duties. There was a sense of dignity in sleep, especially for those who could afford a bit of privacy. In fact, the wealthy Roman elite considered sleep to be a vital part of their health regimen, and it was common to take long afternoon naps as part of their daily routine. For the common Roman, however, sleep was simply a means of recharging after the day's hard labor. The importance of sleep was also reflected in Roman religious beliefs. The god of sleep, Hypnos, and his counterpart, Morpheus, the god of dreams, were both important figures in Roman mythology. People would pray to these gods for peaceful, restorative sleep, and rituals to honor Hypnos were common. Some Romans even kept small figurines or images of the gods of sleep near their beds, hoping for protection from nightmares or restless nights. Dreams, in particular, held significant weight in Roman society. Many Romans believed that dreams were omens, sent from the gods to provide guidance. Dream interpreters, known as oneirocritics, were consulted by those who sought answers to their dreams, hoping for divine insight. Despite the discomfort and chaos of urban life, the role of sleep in Roman society, both in the practical sense of rest and the spiritual significance of dreams, was not overlooked. For the average Roman, sleep was a critical part of survival, a fleeting chance to recharge for another day in the relentless grind of city life. Whether it was in a noisy insula or a quiet villa, Romans understood the importance of sleep, even if the conditions weren't ideal. As you settle into your narrow bed, the noise of the city outside continues, and the scent of the street lingers in the air. You know sleep won't come easily, but you also know that, like everyone else, you must rest, because tomorrow will bring another day of hard work. And in this brief time of rest, you may just dream of the gods, seeking their guidance or messages, knowing that in this world of constant motion, sleep, though imperfect, remains a necessary reprieve, a moment of quiet amid the chaos. As we near the end of our journey through history, let's take a final step into the quiet, cold world of medieval Europe, a world defined by hard labor, harsh conditions, and little respite. Picture yourself in a humble cottage, the fire crackling faintly in the hearth, the scent of burning wood and damp earth filling the air. The night has fallen, and the only light is from the dim glow of a candle, its flickering flame casting long shadows against the stone walls. You lie down on a thin mattress made of straw, your back aching from a long day spent working in the fields. The blanket covering you is nothing more than a rough woolen piece, and the cold air seeps in through the cracks in the walls, making sleep a challenge. The wooden floor beneath you is hard, and there is little comfort to be found in the simple room. Medieval peasants were accustomed to this kind of sleep. Their beds were nothing like the luxurious ones enjoyed by the nobility. The wealthy had their four-poster beds, covered with fine linens and soft feather pillows, but for the common people, sleep was far more utilitarian. It was about survival, not comfort. The beds were often little more than straw mats on the floor, or rough wooden frames filled with hay or straw, offering minimal support. These beds were uncomfortable at best, and many people would sleep on the floor, curled up to conserve warmth, especially in the colder months. The entire family often slept in the same room, sometimes sharing their space with animals for warmth, creating a crowded, noisy sleeping environment. Historians still debate whether peasants in the medieval period got sufficient rest. Many scholars believe that the harshness of their lives meant that sleep was often fragmented and of poor quality. The medieval workday was long and exhausting, with most people waking up at dawn and working until the last light of the day. But even when they did manage to sleep, the physical discomfort of their sleeping arrangements, coupled with the constant noise from other family members or animals, made it difficult to rest deeply. The cold, drafty cottages and the presence of insects and pests also disrupted sleep, making it far from peaceful. For the medieval peasant, sleep was not about comfort but a necessary respite from the labor of the day. The timing of sleep in the medieval period was also different from what we're used to today. Much like in other pre-industrial societies, medieval people often followed a segmented sleep pattern, especially in the winter months when the nights were long. They would go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night for a period of wakefulness. This break in sleep was often used for prayer, reflection, or quiet activities such as reading, writing, or even tending to the fire. After a brief period of wakefulness, they would return to sleep for the second segment of the night, waking again at dawn to start the day's labor. This fragmented sleep pattern was common across medieval Europe, and it was believed that it helped people make use of the long, dark winter nights. Even though medieval peasants had no electricity or modern comforts, their sleep was deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. The lack of artificial light meant that their sleep schedules were governed by the natural cycle of day and night. The early evening hours were reserved for sleep, and there was little to distract them from the basic need for rest. Unlike today, when we can stay up late or wake up at odd hours thanks to modern technology, medieval people had to follow the natural light cycles. Sleep was essential for their survival, giving them the energy needed to carry out the difficult tasks of their day. But despite the physical discomfort and the hardships of medieval life, sleep was still a time for recovery. It was during the night that the body had the chance to repair itself after a hard day's work, to rejuvenate for the following day. The body might not have been able to rest in comfort, but it could still rest enough to prepare for the challenges ahead. And for some, sleep was a time of spiritual reflection and communion with the divine. The religious nature of medieval life meant that prayer and contemplation were integral to their daily routines. Before sleep, many medieval people would pray, asking for protection from evil spirits, for the health of their families, or for strength in their work. For medieval peasants, sleep was an essential act of survival, not just for the body but also for the soul. Even in their uncomfortable, crowded conditions, sleep was a time to recharge, a brief respite in an otherwise harsh world. They may not have had luxurious beds, but they found comfort in the simplicity of rest, knowing that, for a few precious hours, the demands of the day would fade away. As you lie there in your straw-filled bed, listening to the sounds of your family breathing softly in the room, you realize that sleep is more than just a physical necessity. It's a time to recover, to reconnect with your spiritual self, and to prepare for another day of work. The discomfort of your bed fades away as your body sinks into rest, knowing that tomorrow will bring more hard work, but also the promise of another night of sleep, where, for a brief time, you can find peace. As the fire in the hearth burns low and the candlelight flickers, you drift off into sleep, knowing that it is not just an escape from the world, but a vital part of your daily rhythm. A rhythm that has been passed down through generations, where sleep, however brief, remains a sacred time of restoration and connection.